Hello, and welcome to the Beginner's Guide to Genshin Impact. My name is Azuark, and we have finally gotten to the end of our series on introducing elemental reactions. 6 elements have been discussed already, leaving just one final element to go, but you better believe I picked this one for last. For starters, Dendro wasn't even part of the game at launch. I mean, technically it was in the game, kinda. There are Dendro slimes and Dendro Simichurls, but only one reaction for it existed, burning, and there were no Dendro playable characters. It wasn't until the game had been out for a full 2 years and the nation of Sumeru was being introduced that we finally got Dendro added to the mix. And Hoyo decided to get fancy with us. There are 3 true Dendro reactions: burning, catalyze, aka quicken, and bloom. However, much like frozen can lead to shatter, 2 of these lead to secondary reactions, so we better get cracking because we really have a total of 7 reactions to discuss. First things first, Dendro does not react with Cryo, Animo, or Geo. At all, full stop. It feels like there could have been plenty of design space for them to add these reactions when they implemented Dendro, but for whatever reason the developers decided against. So the simplest Dendro reaction is by combining it with Pyro, which causes burning. If you've ever used a Pyro character in the grassy fields of Mondstadt, you've probably caused burning by accident. All burning does is a very pitiful amount of Pyro damage, repeatedly, over time. Technically, both the Pyro and Dendro exist on the enemy together, but the Pyro very rapidly eats the Dendro, much like adding kindling to a fire. So you can very easily sustain burning by reapplying Dendro, but without more fuel, it will eventually burn itself out. Historically, burning has been an unwanted side effect with very limited use, unless you're using a character who has mechanics specifically tied to it, like Emily or Kaniche. So next, let's talk about Catalyze. An enemy hit with both Dendro and Electro is affected by a debuff called Quicken. The symbol for it looks a lot like the Dendro symbol. While Quicken does nothing on its own, it makes enemies especially vulnerable to additional hits of Dendro or Electro. If an enemy with Quicken receives Dendro, it will produce a reaction called Spread. If they are afflicted with Electro, it produces Aggravate. Functionally, Spread and Aggravate are identical. They add more damage to your hit. One thing that is quirky about them, though, is that they're halfway between Melt and Vaporize and the other transformative reactions. Melt and Vaporize take the hit you've dealt and multiply it to be a larger number, but the additional damage they add is included with the original value. Transformative reactions like Overload, Dead, and Swirl cause a fixed amount of damage which occurs as a separate amount. Aggravate and Spread also cause a fixed amount, but it gets included with the original value. This might not seem like a big deal, but there's one important reason why this matters. Aggravate and Spread damage can crit because they're bundled into the original attack. Separate reaction damage cannot crit. Although Aggravate and Spread are still subjected to internal cooldown limitations, remember, that's when you just caused a reaction and the game tells you to count to 3 before it will give you another. These reactions thrive not on being dealt with extremely large attacks like Melt and Vaporize, but on being dealt very frequently. Electro characters are known for their speed, and every 3rd hit will be another Aggravate. The Quicken aura lasts for about 6 seconds, but it's important to note that while it's active, you don't need to keep resupplying both elements. A single hit of Dendro and Electro is good enough, and then you can just stick to one element or the other until you need to refresh Quicken. Just be careful not to hit that target with Pyro or Hydro because they tend to end Quicken prematurely by causing different reactions. What reactions? Well, Bloom for one. Dendro plus Hydro causes Bloom, which doesn't immediately cause damage but does create a plant to appear known as a Bloom Core. After a few seconds, the Bloom Core will explode, dealing damage to both you and the enemies. But if you create a whole lot of Bloom Cores quickly, only 5 can exist at once, and the oldest one will explode automatically. On its own, Bloom is not a very useful reaction. It can deal a lot of damage, but it can also deal a lot of damage to you. More importantly, because you can't really control when the cores will explode, it makes them unwieldy. But what if you could do something with them to produce a more immediate effect? Burgeon occurs when you hit a bloom core with Pyro. It will detonate immediately and cause 50% more damage than a regular bloom reaction. It still hits everything within a small radius, including you, so if you're playing a team that thrives on Burgeon, you better be prepared to have good healing or shielding. Also, just to be completely clear, this is a reaction that effectively requires 3 elements. First Dendro and Hydro, and then Pyro afterward. It's not uncommon for a team to also accidentally create burning from time to time as well if there's not enough Hydro going around. If Bloom and Burgeon sound like scorched earth to you, and you'd rather not have to worry about getting hit by your own reactions, then perhaps you should consider Hyper Bloom instead. Hyper Bloom starts off the same way Burgeon does. Create a Dendro core and hit it with an element. But this time, use Electro instead. The core will detonate, but instead of hitting everything nearby, it will immediately target the nearest enemy and hit them for just as much damage as the Burgeon would have. It won't be AE, so Hyper Bloom is obviously much better in single target scenarios, but because it's not AE, that means it also doesn't hit you. Hyper Bloom is completely safe to use outside of any Bloom cores you fail to trigger. Okay, so if you're confused by all these multi-part reactions, let's recap. Dendro plus Pyro is burning. Usually you don't want this, but it often happens by accident anyway. Dendro plus Electro is catalyze/quicken. This makes enemies take extra damage from future Dendro or Electro attacks where you'll see the names spread and aggravate popping up. Dendro plus Hydro is bloom. It creates a plant that will explode after a few seconds for AE damage. A bloom core plus Pyro is burgeon. It explodes the plant immediately for even more area effect damage. A bloom core plus Electro is hyper bloom. It detonates the plant immediately for single target damage. Understandably, this all might be very confusing, so here's the good news. The developers give you an opportunity to practice all of the reactions in the game. In the same domain where Lisa originally joined your team, you can also head into the Temple of the Lion for various elemental trials, starting at Adventure Rank 16. Unfortunately, they implemented this feature before Sumeru, and they never updated it for Dendro, so sadly you'll have to learn about Quicken and Burgeon the hard way. However, one final note is that for a long while after Dendro was first added, many players felt that teams using Hyper Bloom were very easy, cheap, and powerful teams to work with. They do require you to have an Electro character that's capable of detonating the cores, so either Kuki Shinobu or Raiden Shogun, or an Electro on-field character. But sticking to spread and aggravate's pretty effective too, and Dendro Traveler is the only version of Traveler I actually advocate, so just partnering them with an Electro character of your choice, with or without Hydro, can make for a very simple and effective team setup. We're going to need to talk about team building really soon, but seeing as that's a pretty big topic that will occupy our attention for a while, I intend to steer the channel in a different direction for a little while first. So, until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.